Ladies and gentlemen, in the past I've offered you stories of immense corruption and civilizational failure. We've shown you ineptitude and foolishness at the highest level of governmental power and supposed greatness. This episode will have all of that. But I can also promise you something far more tantalizing. For the 10th episode of No One is Competent, we will be serving you millions upon millions of dead Nazis. Woo! This is No One is Competent, the premium podcast around history and comedy, focused on showing you how bad everyone in the world was at everything. I am your host, Azalea, and I am joined by our research aficionado. How you doing, Jay?
I'm doing well. Kind of pleased that we're finally getting to talk about some Nazis.
Yeah, it's been too long. Like, I don't know why it's taken us so long. When we started this podcast, this was like half the frickin' idea was just talking about fascists being dumb. And I thought there's just no way. It would have been untenable to continue to do this podcast without covering the failures of the German Nazi Party. And that's what we're going to do today. What is the subject of today's podcast, Jaharis?
The subject of today's podcast is Operation Barbarossa. For those who haven't heard of that, that's the codename for the German invasion of the Soviet Union during World War II. It was launched on June the 22nd of 1941. And Barbarossa is used more widely to describe actions on the Eastern Front from that point through to the end of 1941. So that's what we'll be talking about today.
But before we get into that, we mentioned that I am Azalea. That is Jay, you just heard. We are on Twitter. I am at Azalea Wyatt, and Jaharis is at Jaharis48. That's JAEHR. I can't do it. You know, I had a listener. I was talking to a listener the other day, and he was like, you know, you guys say Jaharis' Twitter tag, but, like, no one knows how to spell that.
I feel like it would just take too long to, like, you know, spell it out every episode. It's JAEHAERYS48. But, you can see it in the episode description if you're on YouTube or whatever.
Jay, unfortunately, is not enough of an attention whore to, like, desperately need you to follow him on Twitter, whereas, like, that's one of the few things keeping me from self-harm is other people following me on Twitter. We have YouTube channels. I'm Wyatt the Warweaver. He's Jaharis48, like mentioned. This podcast is done with no sponsors, no commercials, so we would absolutely love it if you could rate us on Apple. Apparently Spotify does not have a rating system that we've found yet. Hack into Spotify and make us a rating system and then rate us 5 stars. Please also, if you're listening on YouTube, like, comment, and subscribe. Go on to the YouTube videos that you're not watching and like, comment, and subscribe to feed the algorithm like the ancient gods of the pre-modern era with sacrifices and the burning of incense. Our music is done by the legendary Sam Bryce, and I don't even want to have how are you doing pre-Thanksgiving banter. Well, I guess it's not pre-Thanksgiving for these people. They're going to listen to this in December. So, Jay, you want to just jump into the episode?
Might as well, yeah.
June 22nd, 1941. Big time, big year. But, like, this is, unless you're a history nerd, and in high school, like, this is probably a period of World War II that most Americans don't know a ton of. I mean, they know it happened, but, you know, we're not in the war yet. So this is kind of a time that I think there's a lot of, like, misconceptions about.
Oh, 100%. I mean, something which a lot of people don't really know is that at the beginning of 1941, Germany and the Soviet Union aren't even at war with each other.
No, they're not. In fact, they might even be quasi-allies from a certain point of view, or potential allies.
Perhaps, yeah. But to kind of step back a bit, in 1941, both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union are pretty young governments. They've been around for 8 and 19 years, respectively, so these are not the most established of states.
Yeah, in the red corner, you have the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which was established in 1922 following the conclusion of the Russian Civil War, which, let me say, is like at least 4 episodes on its own. This saw the communist Bolsheviks under Vladimir, learn how to talk, Vladimir Lenin, triumph over the monarchist White Russians and various other factions, like a lot of other factions. The Soviet Union brought together the bulk of the former Russian Empire, spanning from Siberia in the far east to Belarus and Ukraine in the west, bordering the directly non-communist powers of Central Europe. But in 1924, Lenin would die, and this would pave the way for Joseph Stalin to become the leader of the USSR. Boos from the crowd, boo, boo. Stalin had carefully built up a series of alliances in the government and the military to perfectly position himself to take the reins from Lenin, and once in power, he ruthlessly suppressed dissent of any threat to his regime, real and imagined. In basically every possible way that you can do that, use your imagination. And by the 1930s, Stalin wielded almost absolute authority within the USSR.
A big fan of editing people out of pictures.
The original deepfaker, the original Photoshop king, Stalin, shall we say? Every heavily docked up Instagram model.
The OG influencer.
Yeah, should send up some thanks to Stalin. And in this time, over the course of the 20s and 30s, the Soviet government had worked to heavily modernize the economy and the military to varying degrees of success. Abroad, their communist ideology brought them into severe conflict with their neighbors in Europe and Asia. We're going to go into that later. And it's worth noting that at this point, I would even say the Soviet Union was internationally probably more of a pariah than even Nazi Germany was. Like before the war really started to break out. But that's controversial.
Yeah.
Regardless, a lot of that pariah status came from the USSR for a long time, tried to actively destabilize other countries the same way it had been destabilized in a communist revolution. And, do that, which tends to make people not like you. Though Stalin had heavily abandoned the idea of global revolution. And in the blue corner, or, well, the other red corner, we have...
that would, of course, be Nazi Germany. Now, Nazi Germany was born out of the post-World War I Weimar Republic. The far-right Nazi Party, founded in the 1920s, used political violence and fascist messaging to build up a base of support and seize power within the democratic German state. Adolf Hitler, somebody who you might have heard of, was the head of the Nazi Party and, of course, became chancellor in 1933. Once in the job, he began the process of turning Germany into a single-party state. The constitution was revised to give the chancellor sweeping powers. That occurred after the Reichstag fire. And opposition parties were banned. Hitler would, of course, end up assuming the title of Führer, their leader, in 1934. Now, the ideological base of the Nazis was fascism. The Nazis tapped its German resentment over their defeat in World War I and used racism and anti-Semitism to unite the German people against a series of common enemies. We'll go a little bit more into that later. It's worth noting, however, that unlike in the Soviet Union, which came into existence via a civil war that saw the fall of the previous government, Nazi Germany rose within the German political and economic system. As such, they relied on the conservative leaders of the industry and military to make control over the country.
Yes, those conservative leaders were key to handing fascists power, which totally isn't a lesson or thing that other people should know or look
Well,
at or pay attention
everybody
to or
learned the
keep
lesson.
in mind.
We all learned the lesson, so it'll never happen again.
It's totally not important for modern, like, I don't know, the quick finger count. 8 countries in the world? No, 12? A lot of countries in the world to keep in mind right now.
So all this means that while Hitler was the dictator of Nazi Germany and wielded significant power, his level of absolute control was not as completely certain as Stalin's within the Soviet Union. That's in contrast to popular imaginings where you think of, Hitler as running the show entirely. He relied on a lot of people to support him and to get things done.
Yeah, I think it's more accurate to say that there were plenty of people, mostly those who were the original Nazis who joined the Nazi Party before that was no longer a choice, worshipped Hitler and really looked up to him and to everything. But that was far from universal. The government of Germany was conservative before it was Nazi, and the leadership of its military was still heavily filled with people who had alignments and grew up with and were influenced by non-Nazi ideology. And while, they might play nice with the Nazis and still, nod along, internally they're not all like diehard fanatics yet.
Yeah.
And I mean, again, it's not to say they're good guys. It's just that there's levels,
No.
and not everybody thinks that everything Hitler says is like, mouth of God.
Yeah, though most of them are raging anti-Semites. It's also
no. Well, that's 90% of the continent at this point.
Fair.
Like,
yeah.
I mean,
they don't think
it's not like Winston Churchill isn't a raging anti-Semite.
Yeah.
Like,
So they're not necessarily sure they want to follow like this Hitler guy to the death, but they don't have a problem with like many of his ideas.
It's not like Joseph Stalin isn't a Yeah. There are no good guys, folks. Yeah. Just levels.
Now, once in power, the Nazis also began a program of very rapid military growth, and eventually initiated a series of expansionist moves. In 1936, the German army, in direct contradiction to the Treaty of Versailles, entered and rearmed the Rhineland.
Quick for the folks in the back, what's the Treaty of Versailles?
That was the treaty that was written at the conclusion of World War I, and that basically laid out, the formation of the Weimar Republic, the reparations the Germans had to pay, all the territorial exchanges, and all that stuff between Germany and the Entente. Yeah, in 1938, Germany annexed both Austria and the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. And this expansionism was made possible by the policy of appeasement on the part of France and Britain. Essentially, France and Britain didn't want war with Germany, at least not at this point, and more or less thought that if they let Hitler get his way now, that would kind of kick the can down the road or maybe prevent him from doing anything further. Of course, Britain and France's tolerance for German territorial growth was not limitless. On September 1st, 1939, the German military invaded Poland, and Britain and France subsequently declared war on Germany. And that's seen as the beginning of the Second World War, at least in Europe, and that's something we'll get back to a little bit later.
Insert rant about how World War II had already been going for years in Asia, but I'm not feeling up to it right now. So, the subject of this episode is Germany invading Russia, the Soviet Union, and it going incredibly poorly for them. That's one incompetence. But what's beautiful about Operation Barbarossa is that the incompetencies just fall like lemons from a tree. They are abundant. You just start walking and you just start tripping over them. So before we get to the tank formations and the city envelopments and all the stuff that you guys are rock hard for, let's take a moment to appreciate all of the different flavors, the different food groups, shall we say, of incompetence that led up to that point. Because we're going to take a step back and describe the Soviet-German relations prior to the shoot-shoot-bang-bang.
Indeed. Now, cooperation between the Soviet Union and Germany dates back to the Weimar Republic. Both countries were somewhat maligned by the greater European powers during the 20s. They were, basically both pariahs. Germany for their role in World War I, and the Soviet Union for their communist ideology. And as such, cooperation was seen as promising for both sides.
Yeah, again, we think of, communist paranoia being, a 50s, 60s Cold War thing, but no. As soon as there was a country that was communist, everyone ruling every other country from basically every other ideology was insanely paranoid about their country going communist.
Yes.
In America, in Europe, all around the world. Now, throughout the 20s, the German army was restricted in size and equipment by the Treaty of Versailles we mentioned. But they began a series of secret military exercises conducted in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, they don't have a lot of things, but the one thing they have a lot of is space. And they gave the Germans space to conduct these mass exercises and weapons testing, safe from the eyes of British and French observers. And in return, they received the schematics for new weapons and vehicles from the Germans. Trade also increased between the two nations.
Now, relations between the two nations would sour after the rise of the Nazi Party, as one can imagine. Nazis obviously not being very pro-communist, at least in their ideology. And this reached an absolute low during the mid-1930s. The Soviets signed a treaty of mutual assistance with France, Germany's rival, in 1935. And the Spanish Civil War, which began in 1936, would evolve in part into a bit of a proxy conflict between the Soviet Union and Germany.
Yeah, classic war, the Spanish Civil War, classic war that no one ever talks about, despite it being very cool, directly pitting fascists against anarchists, who are exact polar opposites, no matter what other people try and tell you. And it's really worth noting that when we're talking about 1930s international relations, nobody in 1930s Europe, or anywhere, knew exactly how World War II would go down, or whatever would happen at all. Now, some people are they're reading the writing on the wall, and there are a lot of people who looked very smart in hindsight about what was going to happen. But that was not, say, the majority opinion by any means. And everyone today knows the basics of the Second World War. We know who the Axis powers were: Germany, Italy, Japan. We know who the allies are: UK, France, Russia, America. And we also know that Germany was a genocidal state that would actively devote an obscene amount of their resources to exterminating millions of people, bent on not only conquering new territory, but actively remaking the ethnicity of Europe. But that was not a known quantity. Everything I just described was not a known quantity in the 1930s. There were inklings of it, and the writing was on the wall, and everyone really should have known by the way Hitler talked. But as insane as this sounds, Germany was seen as a normal nation in the 30s.
Yeah, they were perhaps bent on reversing the humiliation of Versailles, but they weren't necessarily the most dangerous country in the world, or even Europe, in the eyes of many. Hitler was spoken of very popularly across Europe and the United States as well, and pretty much every modern country had its own fascist movements within them during the 30s. I mean, Germany wasn't even the first to go fascist, Italy was. So...
yeah. There were attempted fascist coups in France. Spain, of course, went fascist, as we just talked about, and no one really talks about it. There were attempted fascist plots in America and Britain, which are definitely going to be podcast episodes at a certain point. Look up the business plot. Just look it up. It's one of the most important things they didn't teach you in high school. I mean, Hitler was like he was popular. He was his speeches were broadcast and translated across the globe.
Yeah.
Like, for instance, in America, in the late 30s, if you were like an anti-war person, like really against war in Europe, it probably wasn't because you were a pacifist. It was probably because you were a German sympathizer and maybe even a German Bundist.
Good old Charles Lindbergh.
Yeah, or the father of the Koch brothers.
Yep.
There are some speeches from even Churchill saying quite complimentary things about the man.
Yeah.
He was seen as this guy that will love him or hate him. He turned the German economy around, which disproving that's a subject for another podcast. But suffice to say that Nazis equal evil was not a thing that everybody agreed on in 1937, 1938, when all of this is sort of rising up to a boiling point.
Certainly, Britain and France, on their part, feared the Soviet Union about as much as they feared Nazi Germany. And the Soviets viewed the Western imperial powers with as much suspicion as they held towards the Germans. The Nazis, of course, viewed pretty much everyone as a threat.
And that's, like, not incorrect. Like, the Soviets had been invaded by the Western powers
during the Civil War.
Their own revolution. Yeah. That is 100. That's not Soviet paranoia. Okay, like Stalin was a very paranoid person and would do a lot of things out of paranoia. That is not illegitimate paranoia. And it's also not illegitimate paranoia for Western European powers to fear Soviet or Russian invasion. I mean, the 1800s saw decades upon decades of Russian armies being used to enforce the conservative status quo in the post-Napoleonic era.
Yeah, the Soviets also invaded Poland in 1919, and they invaded some of the smaller, Central Asian countries as well in the 1920s, so it's not, a baseless fear.
In general, when discussing history, it's easy to forget the simple rule that hindsight is 20/20, and that rule is useful in rationalizing the relationships, seeing them through a different false light between the various countries in the lead-up to World War II. Specifically, the utter failure, catastrophe, incompetency of the tripartite talks.
Yeah,
Wait, is that how you pronounce that? Tripart?
Yep. Yeah, you got it right.
Tripartite.
Yep.
That's French. Tripartite.
Yeah,
Right? Jay, start talking. I am dumb, man.
Yeah. As mentioned, it would be easy to do an episode on Barbarossa that focused solely on the failures of the Germans, because there are many of them. But it's worth remembering that roughly 5 million Soviet soldiers and countless more civilians are killed, captured, or wounded during this invasion. A figure that could have been drastically lower if not for the failures of Allied diplomacy in 1939.
Yeah, like, eventually Britain, France, and the USSR would be allies, but the fact that they were not allies fast enough cost them, again, casualties in the millions. The failure of the tripartite talks in August of 1939 is a little known yet massively consequential event. If the three nations had an inked military alliance on paper in 1939, it is likely that the outbreak of World War II in Europe would have been delayed, allowing time for Britain, France, USSR to modernize their militaries, or it could have been stopped altogether. Germany's general staff knew that in the case of a two-front war and a British blockade, Germany would not nearly have enough resources to win. That is what had happened the last go-around. And had Germany invaded Poland in that scenario, their early success would have probably been reversed as early as 1940.
The remilitarization of Germany under Hitler was clear for all to see. I mean, it was an important part of Nazi propaganda. They had military parades, videos, and movies highlighting the strength of their new army.
Famously, movies that are overly spoken of as contributing to the success and growth of film techniques.
Yeah, good old Leni Riefenstahl. But, so they weren't exactly hiding these things, and this alarmed leaders across Europe. Britain, France, and the Soviet Union all embarked on their own programs for military expansion and initiated preliminary talks for a military alliance to contain Germany.
We initially had a much longer explanation of this, but to massively oversimplify kind of what everybody at this poker table was thinking in 39, France really, really wants an alliance with the Soviet Union because they want that sweet, sweet two-pronged war for the Germans to have to deal with. But they also want an alliance with the British. But the British are super, super paranoid of the Soviets. And the British also wanted Poland to be included in the alliance. But there's no way the Poles are going to get in bed with the Soviets after the Soviet-Polish War. And the Soviets are playing a bit coy from an alliance because Stalin is just as happy in making an alliance with the Germans as he is making an alliance against them. And this is all kind of, teenage drama-y, but essentially, they squabble and they squabble and they squabble, and they finally get to some official talks in August 12th of 1939, and those talks would last for a grand total of 9 days before failing on the 21st. Essentially, everyone was waiting for someone to blink, and nobody blinked.
Hundreds of thousands of British and French deaths and millions of Soviet deaths could have been prevented. Instead, the three countries were pushed apart by their own diverging machinations and their underestimation of the threat posed by Nazi Germany.
An even bigger problem is we mentioned appeasement, but Neville Chamberlain in Britain is... we make fun of Churchill on this show, and everyone likes to make fun of Churchill because it's becoming popular, possibly because there's a lot of things to make fun of. But, yeah. It's not like there was a dip in the intelligence of leadership when he took over. Let's just put it like that.
Now, as talks with France and Britain stalled, the Soviet Union instead moved to sign an agreement with Nazi Germany, and that would culminate in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed on August 23, 1939.
Yes, that's the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and that will be on the vocabulary test, boys, girls, and non-binary rills. The pact was officially a non-aggression pact. It's hey, I don't mess with you, you don't mess with me, man. But it also contained this secret clause dividing up Eastern Europe into Soviet and German spheres of influence. It coincided with the German-Soviet credit and commercial agreements, which saw the Soviet Union deliver vast quantities of raw materials, including fuel, metals, and food, to Germany in exchange for industrial equipment and weapons designs. This is... I in a past life used to be a chemistry student, and Jay, do you know how many brilliant German chemists in the late 1800s died from inhaling too much fluorine gas?
I don't know the number, but I'm gonna guess quite a lot.
A comical amount. The Germans are just so good at making weapons and chemical bullshit. They're really good at it. It's in their blood. They love dying at age 37 by blowing themselves up trying to make ammonia or some shit. It just calls to them. They just want to combine gases and fiddle with guns. It makes them happy, all right? But the country is famously not the most resource-rich place in the world. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union is, Russia's the largest country in the world today, and the Soviet Union was the largest country in the world then, and they have a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
So they're gonna trade their stuff.
To kind of also explain their motivation of it, because some people might wonder why would they swing from potentially signing an alliance that would contain Germany to helping Germany out. Nobody expected that Germany would be able to beat France so quickly. It was thought that the war would either be prolonged, like the Western Front of World War I, or that the British or French might even win. So from Stalin's perspective, helping out the Germans might act to basically get that prolonged war and bleed these countries dry as they fight against each other. Of course, that's not how that went down.
Also, Stalin will call himself like a father of communism, but and like, the hero of the left while he's alive, and some people after his death, but like Stalin, obviously he wanted to be the only one in charge in his perfect little world that he envisioned, but he does not give a shit about ideological differences with the Nazis. He is not driven like we said, he's the guy who called off the idea that the whole world needs to be under a communist revolution, and he ain't an anti-fascist is what I'm saying. He has no more a opposition to Hitler than he did to Churchill or the leaders of France.
Yeah. There are a lot of funny anecdotes or just propaganda that would come from the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and you have stories about how Ribbentrop, when he's partying with Stalin essentially in Moscow and joking that within a year Soviet Union could join the anti-Comintern Pact with Germany and Japan, which is was a pact designed to combat communism. So yeah, these people are to an extent a bit flexible with their ideology.
So the date that everybody knows is September 1st, 1939. That's when Germany invaded Poland, which would begin World War II in Europe. Yep, Europe, that's the word. Don't know why there was a little pause there. Well, I mean, it says it's a continent, but, it says a lot of things.
Yeah.
And that is Britain and France's line in the sand, so they declare war on Germany on the 3rd of September. But that did little to slow the German army. Poland's situation, there was absolutely no way they could possibly hold out. And that was made even worse on September 17th, when the Soviet troops entered Poland from the east. Not to fight the Germans, but to partition the country in accordance to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. That was part of what had been ironed out.
Yeah, and now Poland, of course, was defeated by October, and what would follow would be a relative lull in the fighting, known as the Phony War. For a while, both sides would simply kind of just look at each other across the border between France and Germany.
The Sitzkrieg, as my high school history teacher called it.
Yeah. Of course, this would end when Germany invaded France in May 1940. The Battle of France would take all of 6 weeks, ending in the surrender of France, the formation of the Vichy government, and the expulsion of the British from the continent. The speed of this victory stunned virtually all international observers, as well as the Germans themselves, and was seen as a proof of the tactics and technology used by the Wehrmacht, that being German armed forces. Nobody expected this war to be so quick. Pretty much everybody thought that the French might either win, or at the very least this would be a very long conflict.
Yeah, because it had been a very long conflict the last time, and also the French defeat in World War II is definitely worth an episode on its own. We're not going to tell you when we're going to do it, but we are planning on doing it. There's massive military failures, and there's massive failures of basically of planning. It's also worth noting that there were a lot of people inside France who were fascists, and when it became looking like maybe the fascists, the Nazis, could be in charge, were like, there have been worse things.
Yeah.
And this is part of why they join up so quickly, they surrender so quickly, and why the Vichy government is in control and is up and running so quickly.
Yeah. Now, by the beginning of 1941, Germany had conquered not only Poland and France, but Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Norway. Italy, Romania, Hungary, and Slovakia had all joined the Axis powers as well. Fighting between the British and Axis would continue in North Africa, but pretty much everywhere else, Germany was in a strong position.
And Germany is like loosely aligned with Spain, right? Though
Yes,
they're not an
correct.
axis. They're technically neutral. And you have Switzerland being neutral, and this means that at this point Germany has dominated the entire continent, but, the British always claimed to not be a part of that continent, and they had defied Hitler's expectations by refusing to surrender. The Battle of Britain, a roughly 4-month-long campaign of aerial bombardment by the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, was launched in July 1940, and it failed to defeat the British Royal Air Force. And this resulted in significant losses in terms of pilots and airframes of the Germans. And it reaffirmed Britain's commitment to remaining in the war.
Yeah, but, at the end of the day, by the time of the outbreak of Operation Barbarossa, the Germans had conquered multiple nations and reordered Europe to revolve around them, all with a relatively minimal loss of lives compared to the bloodbath that was World War I. There are individual battles in World War I, which have higher casualty counts than the entire Battle of France for the Germans. So, how could anything go wrong from here on out?
It's probably also worth speculating that, the fact that there was no one in the leadership of France that didn't remember the Battle of the Somme. In fact, some of them were probably there. And as much as I make fun of people who capitulated with the Soviets and joined the Vichy government, the Somme is a hell that has arguably never been repeated on the face of the planet. And there is some nobility in wishing to dodge another one of those situations. But yeah, the Germans are they're riding high. Again, they didn't even. It was them beating the French, the great land empire of Europe, was like, well, if that was easy, there's no way anything else could be challenging.
Yeah. Now, the German General Staff began work on plans for an invasion of Russia in July 1940. The final plan was approved by Hitler in December of that year, and that's when it receives its final codename, Operation Barbarossa, which is named after a Holy Roman Emperor. Though it also received its tentative invasion date, the 15th of May, 1941.
Now, even the most fascist and evil of regimes need a stated reason to go to war, a casus belli, if you will. You gotta put something on the propaganda posters, right? You can't just say, we don't like that guy's face, so we're gonna go over there and kill him. And now we need to talk about Germany's quote-unquote motivation to go to war. See, in 1941... Germany was triumphant. The war wasn't over, but their victory seemed almost completely certain. And when you look at all of the countries that they've either conquered or been aligned with, let's go it down again. Poland, France, Belgium, Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, Italy, Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, and then you have Spain, Switzerland, maybe a few others on reasonable terms with them. Why risk that? Why push your luck with a country that you have a non-aggression pact with? Well, because of incompetence, that's why.
Yeah. A realist stance on the situation would be that Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union were both significant military powers, very aggressive ones. And when you have two powers of such size and stature directly next to each other, war is likely to occur, caused by one side or the other, and in this case it would be caused by the Germans. Hitler's decision to go to war with the Soviet Union was motivated probably by a few different factors. The Nazi war machine up to this point relied heavily on Soviet supplies, particularly oil, to operate. This, of course, gave Stalin a great deal of potential leverage over Germany. If the Soviets cut off trade with Germany, the Germans would be forced back into a situation resembling that of their starvation under British blockade during the First World War. And while Stalin had not displayed any signs that he would break with Germany, neither side trusted each other.
Yeah, World War I saw years of rationing and then starvation within Germany as they were cut off from all sea routes because their navy was crippled, besides famously the U-boat division early on.
Yeah.
And everyone within Germany remembered the ration days, the starvation days. That would part of be why the Nazis came to power, promising that would never happen again. Obviously, the Nazis are thought of as fascists, and it's always important to remember the role of ideology when analyzing any of their actions. Hitler's ultimate goal for Germany was not to share Eurasia with the Soviet Union, but expand Germany's Lebensraum. This is where we're going to combine that memory of the blockade days with the fascist desire to have no one standing other than you. So Lebensraum directly translates to living space. This is an idea that had been developing and was written down in Hitler's Mein Kampf. He wrote a book about this plans. He noted that other great imperial powers of the world had large amounts of territory for their people. Russia had the Far East, America had its West, and Britain and France had their colonies. But Germany had no such equivalent, her colonies being stripped from her at the conclusion of World War I. It's worth noting that in order to win World War II, Britain would completely starve and extract from its colonies in order to fuel its war machine.
Oh, yeah.
I always think World War II is most fascinating when you analyze it through resources, food being the biggest one. I think people usually analyze it through the lens of. Oil is another big one that was huge for both the Germans and the Japanese. But moving on, according to Hitler's ideology, the Russian people and the Slavs in general were inferior to the Aryan Germans. Race, especially the idea of white races, is a complete social construct. I mean, you might look at a Russian guy and a German guy and be like, those guys look exactly the same. But that is certainly not how these people at this point in history saw it. So you've got a people who are inferior, which means it's okay to kill them. It is like, this isn't just simple racism. Like, in these people's worldviews, it is not morally bad to murder these people, and you have to keep that in mind when looking at their actions. And if you do murder them, well, then you get the vast expanses of the Soviet Union. Ukraine is famous for these just massive grain fields. It's called the breadbasket of Europe. It's like their it's like their Indiana or whatever. And so this means that the defeat and the genocide of the Slavs would put Germans in a perfect position to dominate a Eurasian empire. And while one can debate the extent to which Nazi ideology was a driving factor behind Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union, I'm going to kind of talk about that at the end of this podcast, it's clear that it had a significant impact on German political and military thought during the invasion.
Yeah, and that's something worth keeping in mind, because we will talk about this operation mostly in military terms. That's how it's mostly discussed. But alongside Barbarossa, you also have a political program of genocide in Soviet territories by the Germans. They will commit massive war crimes, and they come up with an actual policy, which is to extract as much food from Soviet territories as possible to feed the German people. And if this leads to starvation in Soviet territories, that's all the better, because you'll get rid of those people.
In America, we usually think of the Nazis' desire to genocide the Jews, but they had plans to do it to every ethnic group that wasn't them. They just didn't get the opportunity to do it to everybody.
Yeah.
Fully, at least. So, of course, every reasonable decision to go to war with another country must be based on the capability, not just the desire. So, Before we talk about how stupid it was, how feasible was it on paper for Germany to invade and defeat the Soviet Union in 1941?
Well, according to both the German general staff and the intelligence agencies and analysts of foreign countries at the time, the German victory was not only plausible, but quite likely. The Soviet Union was vast, as was its military, but the general perception of the Soviet army was disorganized and poorly led. Basically, the Soviet Union was seen as a lesser than the sum of its parts. If it could be hit hard enough, it would fall apart as an effective political entity. Hitler himself has a famous quote about this, saying that one only needs to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will collapse.
It's easy to view this optimism as a result of racism stemming from the Nazi views of Slavic peoples, and while that may have been a factor, there's real evidence at the time pointing towards Soviet weakness, though I must also imagine that, on top of them being racist towards the Slavs, there's also a lot of thoughts about being better than communists, and wanting to prove communism wrong and weak as an ideology.
100%. Russia in general had proven to be a bit of a paper tiger throughout the early 20th century. Tsarist Russia's defeat against the Japanese in the Russo-Japanese War and eventual collapse in World War I showed that Russia, in spite of her size, could be beaten by capable foes. And World War I is important to remember because everybody in Germany, really everybody in Europe in leadership at this time, probably fought in World War I. And they would have remembered that Russia was defeated. The Eastern Front was relatively easier for Germans than the Western Front. And the Soviet Union seemed to carry on in the tradition of Imperial Russia in this regard. While the Bolsheviks were able to defeat the Whites during the Russian Civil War, the Soviets struggled against more competent enemies. In 1919, the Soviets invaded Poland in an attempt to retake land controlled by the Tsar, and they were defeated decisively by the Poles and eventually signed a treaty confirming Poland's territorial gains.
And you say, well, that was just when they were getting off their feet, but in 1938, the Red Army would fight the Japanese along the Manchurian border in a skirmish known as the Battle of Lake Khasan. While the USSR was able to repulse a Japanese advance, they took incredibly high casualties despite significantly outnumbering their enemy.
And perhaps most significantly, the Winter War between the Soviet Union and Finland, that was launched in November of 1939, did quite a lot to damage the reputation of the Red Army. While the Soviets were able to win minor territorial concessions from the Finns, they did so at the expense of heavy losses in a conflict that was expected to be an easy and decisive victory for the Soviet Union.
We are just tripping over future podcast episodes today, aren't we?
This is so much to do with World War II and just the general sphere of World War II.
There's a reason that historians devote their lives to a few months of one theater of it.
Yeah.
So the Soviet army did win a clear victory against the Japanese during the Nomonhan incident in 1939, a large-scale border battle in the Far East that lasted for 4 months, but this battle was largely overlooked by the Germans, who generally had a low opinion of the fighting capability of the Imperial Japanese Army, mostly because of racism, and thus did not see it as a significant battle.
Yeah, and it's a name to keep in mind is the Soviet general who was actually in charge in the Far East during this battle was a man named Georgy Zhukov. And Zhukov would get promoted to chief of the general staff for the Soviet Union in the beginning of 1941. Zhukov, of course, will be famous for his roles later on in the war, but basically the Soviets have in charge in 1941 a guy who actually does know how to win, but the Germans don't really consider his win to be of particular note, because it was against a lesser power, a non-European, non-white army.
Fascists are dumb. These defeats revealed several weaknesses throughout the Soviet army. Soldiers were poorly trained, their commanding officers were little better. Communication between units was poor. Effective combined arms operations were rare. The higher ranks had been devastated by the purges. of Stalin, which had deprived the army of some of its best thinkers. The Soviet army had developed a nuanced doctrine, embracing the mobility provided by tanks and armored vehicles during the military exercise of the 20s, and some of which had been conducted alongside the Germans, but most of that had been lost as a result of the purges. Remember, the Soviet Union is a multi-ethnic empire. We talked about this during our Soviet-Afghan episode, but like when we talk about communication between units being difficult, those units might not speak the same damn language.
Yeah. And, additionally, the Germans held the view that the Soviet Union was structurally weak, and that, like Tsarist Russia before it, it would collapse in the face of a strong enemy. This was backed by intelligence reports suggesting that the Soviets would not be able to raise many new divisions to compensate for losses suffered during the opening stages of the campaign.
I also have to imagine that because the Soviet Union, even though like Russia had existed before, like they had completely reorganized their society after the revolution. And when we talk about the effectiveness of officer corps, we often talk about decades, if not centuries, of tradition. I mean, the Germans can certainly talk about centuries of tradition in training and drilling officers. Is it worth like? I mean, the purges couldn't have helped, but like, was the youth of the Soviet officer corps a factor in making them poorly trained?
Yeah, I mean, they were like statistically on average just younger than the officer corps of other countries because of Soviet Union being a younger country and because of the purges. And this has its advantages, but it also has the disadvantage in that there is a definite lack of experience, especially early on in 1941.
So we've spoken about how the German army had both realistic and unrealistic reasons to think that the Soviets were weak, and from their position, they are the strongest they have ever been. Remember, the Battle of France was going to be this long, drawn-out, potentially years-long affair, and it's over? It's over! The rapid success of the German army against their enemies was proof of their ability to win against overwhelming odds, and it gave Hitler and his army this sense of invincibility, which they fed into their propaganda about being God's chosen people and this, the Ubermensch, the superior race, all you've heard about them.
Yeah. The only real significant voice of opposition to Barbarossa within the German military came from Admiral Erich Raeder, who was the head of the German Navy. But due to the Navy's minimal role in the coming fight, his opinion was pretty much entirely ignored. I mean, what does the Navy know about winning a war on land?
So, moving on to the pre-invasion stage. The plans for what would become Operation Barbarossa had their origins the summer of 1940, and they spent months leading up to the process of actually invading. The plan to go to war with the USSR was drafted and redrafted by generals multiple times. The thing they kept disagreeing on during the planning phase was the importance of capturing Moscow, the USSR's capital. Most German generals favored advancing along the Soviet flank, north towards Leningrad and south towards Kyiv, over a direct assault on Moscow. We're going to have a map on the YouTube channel while we're talking about this.
Yeah.
But suffice to say, like, I guess the idea is, like, well, if you drive straight into the heart of the beast, then you could be enveloped from the sides, where if you take the slower route, get the north tied down, get the south tied down, you're then safer when you go into Moscow. And this is kind of what they are arguing about.
Yeah, but, Franz Halder, who was the chief of the Oberkommando des Heer, that would be the OKH, or the German General Staff, saw the capture of Moscow as being the most important
Germany
priority.
is just such a nonsense fucking language. I'm sorry. The Oberkommando Hussar.
Yeah, good old Franz Halder saw the capture of Moscow as being the most important priority of the invasion, as in his mind it would bring about the capitulation of the Soviet Union.
So drive in fast, take the capital, and then they'll just drop their weapons. And that kind of worked in France, hadn't it?
Yeah. Now, Hitler himself became involved in the planning for Barbarossa, and he sided with most of his generals against Halder. He viewed Moscow as a less important target and prioritized the industrial facilities of the north and south over it. The northern route would allow the Germans to capture the key port, which is Leningrad. For context, Leningrad is now St. Petersburg. That was the old name of it. The Soviets renamed it. As well as the industrial areas up north. And the southern advance would give Germany possession over USSR's farmland in the Ukraine, and put them in a position to drive towards the oil fields of the Caucasus. Only after capturing Leningrad would Moscow be attacked, according to Hitler.
So quick question about Halder, Franz Halder, this guy in charge. We mentioned before that there were every leader of the German military was kind of on a spectrum of Nazism and how much they agree with the ideology and how much they'd kind of been there from the beginning. Where did Halder stand?
So Halder was, he comes from the old Prussian officer corps, and I would say that he agreed with Nazi racist ideology. He certainly had no issues carrying out war crimes. I think he personally did not like Hitler as much. He kind of thought, like some of the old Prussians thought, that, he was smarter than Hitler, that Hitler was a up-jumped corporal. He was not a general. He didn't have the right to be telling him what to do, or meddling directly in his plans. So, he'll actually later be arrested later on in the war for being involved in the 1944 plot to assassinate Hitler. It seems like he wasn't involved in that plot, but he was involved in the earlier one. So yeah, he's not super pro-Hitler, but he's certainly fine with a lot of the racist ideology of the Nazis.
And do you think that gave him clearer eyes as a sort of contrast to the other generals who were siding with the Fuhrer?
To an extent, yeah, especially over people who were younger and maybe more enamored by Hitler. You think of, Rommel wasn't involved in this operation, but Rommel being a younger general who was, came up closely linked with the Nazi Party. Halder was a part of the old Prussian officer corps that goes back to World War I. Yeah. They were traditionalists. They always thought that they were the smartest people in the room. And Halder, I would say, is not right about the idea of driving to Moscow, but that position does give him a little bit more clarity to kind of like examine Hitler's plans and criticize them.
So, what was that plan? Well, we have 3 prongs. Army Group North, which has 30 divisions, tasked with driving towards St. Petersburg, that's Leningrad, and seizing it. This is important because Leningrad is both a port, but a heavily industrialized area. So if we grab that, we can take away Soviet industrial power and use it for ourselves. You have the biggest Army Group Central, with 51 divisions, which is tasked with capturing Smolensk before going on to assist Army Group North in taking Leningrad. Leningrad would obviously, the old capital, St. Petersburg, is going to be incredibly well fortified, incredibly powerful. So they're sort of building into their plans, and it's going to be really hard to take it. Now, yeah. Army Group South is going to have 43 divisions, being joined by 14 extra Romanian divisions. And they are going to capture Kyiv, which is currently the capital, that's the word, of Ukraine, yep. And its surrounding areas. They're going for that sweet, sweet bread basket. Beyond that, you had a further 24 divisions being kept in reserve. And all in all, this invasion force has a massive 140 divisions, making it easily the largest invasion force in human history. I say that, but I do not know what that means. A division could be 4 guys for all I know. How many people are we talking about?
Depending on its specific role, a German army division would be between 12 and 25,000 people.
Okay, yeah, that's a lot.
Yeah.
And that's including tanks and jeeps and planes and...
Yeah, this is including infantry divisions, armored divisions, artillery divisions, all of it. The scale of armies in the two world wars is sometimes mind-boggling. Just people of our age have never seen military forces that large. So to put that into context, this means that the Germans had around 3.6 to 3.8 million personnel ready for the invasion of Russia, the Soviet Union. And meanwhile, the Soviets had a strength of about 2.6 to 2.9 million defending the border, meaning that the Germans actually at least expected to outnumber the Soviet Union, and this expectation actually turned out to be pretty accurate. Also worth noting, again, these are only Soviet forces that are directly along the border. The Soviet army obviously is spread across their entire country. There are more men just elsewhere in the Soviet Union.
So, German planners assumed that the Soviet army, unlike the Tsarist army during Napoleon's invasions, would be forced to engage and fight the Germans in the western regions of the Soviet Union. A modern army could never abandon the industrialized areas, and it was hoped that the German army groups, particularly Army Group Central, would be able to defeat the Soviets decisively west of the Dnieper and Dvina rivers, and the Soviets would be able to fall apart soon afterwards. This is kind of that kick down the door and the whole building will collapse idea.
Yeah. Now, Halder and Hitler differed on their idea of how to defeat the Soviet Union, but agreed that victory would be short, quite likely by the end of the year. The term of 4 months was generally used. That's how long they expected it to take. As a result, little thought was put into the logistical challenges that the German army would face trying to fan out over such a wide area of land. The amount of trucks the Germans had not increased significantly since the Battle of France, and railroads would be of no use early on as the Soviet rail system used a different gauge to that of Central Europe.
Side note, they used a different rail system specifically so they could not be invaded.
Yeah.
If you don't know how trains work, basically, a train got to go on tracks, and if you change the size or the proportions of the track, then you got to use a different train, or at least different wheels.
Yeah, so, and something that's kind of lost in the popular way we imagine World War II, because we think of it very mechanized. The Germans are relying in large part on vast amounts of horses, like they just have horse-drawn carts and artillery. And the Soviets do as well. Because they're not fully mechanized armies. So these issues were not seen as important to the Germans. The provision of sufficient winter gear was also not seen as a high priority, as the fighting was expected to be over by winter.
Now, this is objectively stupid, but the Frenchmen knocked out of the war far earlier than anyone thought they were going to be. So surely we can do the same thing to a territory 10 times the size and not worry about logistics.
Yep.
In December of 1940, a series of war games were conducted under the leadership of General Friedrich Paulus. I don't care if I'm mispronouncing that name.
Well, Paulus actually, Paulus is a name to remember. Not for this episode, but maybe for the next one.
Don't spoil the next episode, Jay. We're keeping that under wraps. They gotta listen to the end. We gotta reward them for listening to the end. We have to we have to inspire devotion and fanaticism in our listeners. The NIC Nation.
What?
Yeah, the NIC Nation, the No One Is Competent Nation. Our hordes of fans. That's what we're calling them now.
I feel like you're trying to start a cult.
I am not. When have I, Azalea podcast man, ever listen, it's not a cult. It's just a group of people who all call themselves the same thing and love us and would be totally willing to come to my compound in Augusta, Georgia and train in arms to resist local... you're just a party pooper. Anyway, this guy Frederick Paulus
Friedrich.
would
Yeah.
run these war games. And the result of these war games was far from the quick and easy victory predicted by Halder and Hitler. Paulus reached the conclusion that Operation Barbarossa was a highly optimistic plan, and if the Soviets' assumed weaknesses were wrong, even slightly, then the German army would not have the logistical means to achieve the goals set forth by the plan. By the time the army reached Leningrad or Moscow, they would likely have no reserves left. And if the Russians managed to maintain a significant military force east of the Dnieper-Geneva line, German victory would almost be impossible. In the book writing business, we call this foreshadowing.
Yeah. Unfortunately for the Germans, though, and unfortunately for Friedrich Paulus, his war games were ignored by his higher-ups in the Nazi regime. Hitler and the bulk of his generals had convinced themselves of the inevitability of German victory, and they were not going to hear otherwise.
And now, about an hour and 10 minutes into an episode on Operation Barbarossa, we will begin talking about Operation Barbarossa, which began at 3:15 a.m. on the morning of June 22nd, 1941, with a series of artillery bombardments followed by an armored thrust across the border. Now, at first, everything be coming up daisies. The opening phase of Barbarossa seemed to validate all of the German assumptions going into the plan. Soviets were caught off guard, their forces were unable to offer a coherent resistance. Army Group Center alone was able to capture 20 Soviet divisions. That's like a sixth of all of the border divisions by the end of June. The entire Soviet armies are just being encircled and defeated across the front line.
Now, as per German expectations, the Soviets were fighting for territory and not withdrawing.
Wait, hold up. Did I read that right? That means they captured 20 Soviet divisions.
Yeah.
June 22nd to end of June. That's a week.
Yeah.
In a week.
Yep.
Damn. Keep going.
Yeah. Now, as for German expectations, the Soviets were fighting for territory. They weren't just withdrawing as the Tsar's army had once done against Napoleon. Indeed, Soviet resistance was fierce, as Soviet doctrine emphasized offense over defense. Soviet units counterattacked whenever possible. The issue for the Soviets was that lackluster communication and tactics meant that these counterattacks often consisted of piecemeal frontal assaults, leading to heavy casualties and no territorial gains.
Was this basically a problem of, not everybody going at once and not being able to capitalize
Yeah,
on
it wouldn't
victories?
be coordinated across a front line or even a theater. It would more just be like, your major or captain or whatever decides to take his men and be like, we're going to charge the enemy, and without really informing or telling anybody else nearby.
Yeah, so they do, and they get some gains, but then their flanks are exposed and it's all just erased.
Yeah. Now, the German Air Force was similarly able to destroy a significant portion of the Soviet Air Force on the ground and establish air superiority over much of the front line.
The reason to why the Soviets were caught off guard is a matter of historical debate to this day and sweet incompetence. Soviet intelligence had received many indicators of an impending German invasion in the last 6 months, ranging from intercepted messages to interrogating German reconnaissance pilots shot down by the Soviets to reports of the Soviet spies. But Stalin seems to have just believed that the German military buildup was a bluff to bait the USSR into launching a war. Stalin in general likely knew that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was only temporary and that war would come, but he did not believe that Hitler would attack so early. Stalin's generally cautious nature likely meant that he would only seek war with Germany on his terms, once the Soviet army was much stronger, and his paranoid nature led him to dismiss warnings of the invasion as ploys on the part of Germany and British intelligence.
Yeah, there's actually an incident where basically the day before the Barbarossa begins, a German army soldier who was actually a communist literally swims across a river to go and join, to reach Soviet troops, border guards, and tell them about Operation Barbarossa. And this makes it all the way up to to Zhukov and Timoshenko and Stalin, and they basically just have the guy arrested.
I mean, this reminds me of a previous ruler of Russia, Nicholas II. There's this thing I can never get out of my head about Nicky, where before the famously disastrous Russo-Japanese War, he writes in his journal that he doesn't think war is going to happen with Japan because, quote, I do not wish it, and Stalin definitely be serving some real I do not wish it vibes.
Yeah. So in general, the opening phase of Barbarossa was catastrophic for the Soviet Union. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were killed or captured, and General Halder went so far as to declare that the Soviet Union had essentially been defeated in early July. Hitler was even planning on diverting troops from Army Group Center at the time to north and south to just further their gains. Basically, they're acting as if they've pretty much already won, and now it's just a matter of details.
By August of 1941, Germany's triumph looked even more certain. The three army groups were advancing at a rapid pace and achieving victory after victory. However, by this point, German generals noticed that some of their assumptions were incorrect. Soviet resistance was fierce, as was expected, but it was more persistent than expected. Soviet counterattacks continued despite numerous defeats, and Soviet soldiers seemed sufficiently motivated by the defense of their homeland to carry out these attacks. In spite of their rapid advances, the German army took more losses in July 1941 than they had done in any month of the war prior to that date, or indeed any month until December of the following year. And it was also noted that the German army had almost completely run out of reserve soldiers.
Pretty much just like what Friedrich Paulus expected. With all that being said, the situation still looked good for Germany, to the point where Franz Halder began to push for his pet project, that being a drive towards Moscow. And Halder was attempting to convince Hitler of the importance of Moscow, and Hitler ended up vacillating between changing his mind and sticking with his original focus on Leningrad and the south. Now in this field, this led to numerous delays, with entire divisions unaware exactly of where they would be heading next.
We were looking at weeks of just people sitting around, eating up their food?
Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
So this leads to late August, where Hitler will finally capitulate between his vacillations and approve Operation Typhoon, where Army Group Center is going to attack Moscow. He had been convinced by Halder that Army Groups North and South had enough forces to accomplish their missions on their own, and this seems to be the case, as by September, Leningrad is being directly sieged by Army Group North, and Kyiv had already been captured by Army Group South. Leading to the Battle of Moscow! Da-da-da! Da-da-da-da! Which is pretty important.
Yeah.
Ain't it, Jay?
Indeed, yeah, Operation Typhoon, or the Battle of Moscow, would eventually be seen as the turning point of Operation Barbarossa.
We have to have another operation inside our operation so you can have a little bit of operation while you're operating.
Indeed. Now, the capture of Smolensk by Army Group Center in September had opened up the road to Moscow for the German army.
Where is Smolensk geographically for the people who are not looking at the YouTube slides?
And you can imagine if you're in, say, Poland and you want to drive to Moscow, Smolensk is going to be directly on the road to Moscow, and that's why it's important. It's about the same latitude as Moscow, but a bit to the west.
Yeah, it's like how you gotta go through Dublin when you're making your way from Augusta to Cordele.
What?
Yeah, you're cutting through Dublin on the way from Augusta to Cordele, Georgia.
Sorry, I'm not Georgian, unlike you or Joseph Stalin, I suppose.
Hey, buddy. Listen, buddy. Listen, buddy.
Georgian hero.
Moving on.
So again, the capture of Smolensk means that the roads open to Moscow. However, the unexpectedly fierce Russian resistance had taken a heavy toll on German logistics, with the army now running low on vehicles and spare parts. The German army also had pretty much no reserves of men left to reinforce the campaign. And additionally, the German advance was slowed significantly by the start of the muddy season. This is a little kind of a overlooked aspect of Russian weather. But before the snow in the winter, you often have periods of heavy rainfall that basically just turn all the dirt roads into mud and make it very difficult to traverse.
As a result of these issues, German forces did not reach the outskirts of Moscow until November, upon whence they were forced to attack defensive lines as the temperature drops. On the opposing side, Soviet forces in and around Moscow began to see reinforcements, as Soviet divisions from the Far East, many of which were veterans of the skirmishes against the Japanese, began to arrive in significant quantities. At the beginning, Germany was facing 118 estimated divisions. Now they'd have to face, all 170.
Or even more, because as it turns out, that 170 number the Germans predicted, that was an underestimate too. The actual number was in the 200s at least. So in mid-November, as Army Group Center began to attempt to encircle Moscow, but their forces were repulsed by the Soviets. The Germans were then forced to respond by just continuing to advance frontally on the city.
World War II, if you study the land battles, is all about encirclements. You get around them, and then you hit them from all sides, and then they die. This is a pretty simple tactic. Humans have been using it for as long as we've had formation-based warfare. But you say, okay, we can't get all the way around, because the thing about encirclement is that it does leave you exposed, going from all sides. It takes a lot of people, it takes a lot of coordination, and you have to be darn sure that once you put your back to a thing to go forward into the city, that nothing's going to hit you, and they couldn't be sure of that. So on December 2nd, the German army is 15 miles from Moscow. Some of the reconnaissance elements are even 5 miles from the city. But that is when the first winter blizzards begin. And while this is all going on, Leningrad / St. Petersburg in the north is remaining defiant despite being under siege. And we will now move into the bitter end of Operation Barbarossa.
Yes. A few days later, on the 5th of December, the Red Army would launch a series of coordinated counterattacks across the width of the front line. These attacks mostly petered out, failing to push the Germans back significantly. However, they did manage to put an end to German advances and effectively bring Operation Barbarossa to a close.
This is outside of Moscow, right?
Yes, there's some counteroffensives in Moscow, but a lot of these are just across the front line. And because they're all doing this at once, as opposed to, a force counterattacking here and there every now and then, that kind of shows that, the Germans have to stop. They can no longer keep on risking things.
So this is the first time that the Soviets have really gotten their shit together enough to all counterattack at once, something that they haven't done before.
Yeah.
So we close in on Moscow, but then the blizzard starts, and suddenly the Soviets lunge forward in a massively bloody battle. We beat them back, but now we can't advance, and the blizzards are coming. See, the German army expected this to all be over within 4 months, and now we're at month 6, and the Soviets just showed a massive display of force and no sign of surrender or collapse. And now the German army was stuck in the Soviet Union, hunkering down for a fierce winter they were not fully equipped for, and with supply lines stretched to the breaking point.
Yeah, it was clear that no further advances could be made in the winter. Hitler and the German general staff would have to go back to the drawing board and come up with a new series of operations for the following year. Over the course of those 6 months, about 168,000 Germans and 566,000 Soviet soldiers have been killed. And that's not even factoring the countless civilian deaths, because the Germans did very big war crimes.
Probably just understood by the words German and war that crime gonna come later, but in World War II. But like, just to emphasize that did happen. But all of that Soviet blood, you say, well, they kill way more Soviets than the Soviets kill the Germans, but Germans didn't achieve their victory. So why did Germany fail, despite catching the Soviets off guard and achieving many tactical victories in the opening weeks of Barbarossa?
Now, you may have noticed that we use the word assumption or assume several times this episode, and that's intentional. The failure of the German strategy can be fundamentally traced to the failure of their assumptions on Soviet strength and capabilities. And one of the most common axioms you'll hear in regards to warfare is know your enemy. But there can be a danger in following that line of thought too closely. After all, it's virtually impossible to know your enemy completely. Guesses, estimations, and assumptions are common in warfare, and commanders have to make do with what information they have.
In the case of the Germans, a combination of historical confirmation bias, the record of relatively poor Soviet performances in the interwar period, and lackluster German intelligence led to German leaders assuming that the Soviets were weaker than the numbers suggested. Had the Germans made their plans based on the assumption of a simple 1-to-1 ratio in terms of capability, reminiscent of the most basic strategy games, they would have realized that Barbarossa was essentially impossible.
Had every German assumption been correct, they may have achieved victory. Instead, most German assumptions were flawed at best and completely incorrect at worst. The Red Army was simply much bigger than the Germans thought. They expected the Soviets to have roughly 170 divisions, which was true. They did not expect the Soviets to be able to raise many more divisions, however. In reality, the Soviets had, according to some estimates, close to 300 divisions by the end of 1941.
We are talking about the largest country in the history of the world right now. Remember, the Germans had no reserves. They sent everyone they had to Operation Barbarossa. The Soviets had blood to spare.
Now, Soviet resistance was also far more persistent than the Germans thought. Soviet morale did not collapse, and relentless Soviet counterattacks took a heavy toll on German lives and logistics.
Soviet tactical leadership, while still relatively poor, was better than the Germans thought. The army had begun a series of reforms after the Winter War, and while they weren't complete in June of 1941, the Soviet army was at this point better than they started in 1939. The additions of officers experienced in the fight against Japanese, like Zhukov, who was appointed Chief of General Staff in February of 1941, further strengthened the Soviet army.
In general, Soviet political leadership was far more stable than the Germans expected. German planners had some sort of vague notion that the Soviet Union would politically collapse, without really elaborating on what that would entail or look like. In reality, the Soviet Union did not collapse at all. Indeed, the Soviet bureaucracy remained intact and strong enough to the point where the Soviets were actually able to even evacuate a decent amount of factory equipment via railroad to the regions east of the Ural Mountains, all while the time the Germans were invading.
It's worth noting this is all based off of what happened in World War I when Russia did fold. And if you've been listening to Mike Duncan's Revolutions podcast about the Russian Revolution right now, you will know that Russia in 1917 was one of the most epic shit shows that humanity had ever seen up to that point. Like, constant a mini revolution just a decade prior, constant riots, constant strikes, a large anti-fascist, anarchist, and communist movement. Everyone was upset. Everyone was falling apart. The state was collapsing from every direction. You had mutinies constantly. This is not the case in World War II. So, say what you will with the Soviets, and I fundamentally believe this. They were far more competent than the Tsarist regime they replaced, and the people trusted them a lot more. They would not fold so easily.
Now, the failure of Operation Barbarossa is something that should not have needed the benefit of hindsight to predict. And the reason why few German leaders predicted it is that the successes of their earlier campaigns had given them a sense of invincibility. Any evidence running contrary to this, such as the results of Pallas's war games, were ignored. The Soviets were weak and the Germans were strong. This was taken at face value to be true, and worked into the planning for Barbarossa. At the end of the day, Barbarossa is a textbook example of how dangerous assumptions can be in warfare.
Remember, these plans were all made by a micro-clique of generals from a very similar background who were all together constantly, have been hyped up on war propaganda and the elations of their own victory, and I imagine a massive amount of groupthink went on in these meetings. This is not even to speak to the arrogance of German fascism built into Nazism. I'll touch on that in a second. But before I get into that, Jay, how about you tell what these German troops hunkering down the snow outside of Moscow have to look forward to after the winter of 41?
Well, of course the war in the East did not end that winter. The Germans were battered, but they were not broken, and they had no intent on withdrawing from their conquests. As Germany planned for the following summer's offensives, a new plan was settled on, a thrust in the south to the oil fields of the Caucasus. In the way of this thrust would be the Soviet city of Stalingrad, and the siege that would take place there would go on to become one of the most famous battles in modern military history.
It will also be the subject of episode 11 of the No One Is Competent podcast. But for now, I want to conclude with a little bit of psychoanalysis of the situation, a little bit of psychoanalysis of the German people and the Nazis that was going on right now. At some point in all these episodes, in the product of this podcast, we're going to talk about the nature of fascism. We'll define it, we'll lay it out. But here, I want to talk a little about the basics of fascist psychology that helped contribute to Operation Barbarossa and the German belief that their victory was easy and inevitable when it was practically impossible. We can talk about Lebensraum, we can talk about not wanting to repeat the hungry years of World War I, we can talk about how, the Nazis and the Soviets were both young, hungry, expansionist states and were going to fight eventually, but it is foolish to ignore the psychology of a fascist. See, a fascist isn't just a violent or a racist person. A fascist is a person who follows a very specific personality pattern, which is often why they're very predictable and they act very similarly. They tend to be obsessed with highly similar things. When studying fascists, we often describe these things they're obsessed with as cults. There's the cult of death, of tradition, of obedience. But what generally causes the downfall of fascists is the cult of action for action's sake. One of the reasons fascists succeed, that the Nazis succeeded, is that they're good at giving restless young men something to do. Fascists are obsessed with change, with reformation, with breaking the world into resembling the one that they think exists or want to exist or existed far ago or whatever. Hitler promised a new golden age, a sacred era, and they will act to manifest their goals. These are not people who sit on the couch and dream of better days or bemoan current problems. Okay? Before taking political power, Nazis would band together in gangs and roam the streets, beating up anyone who didn't agree with them. They'd vandalize Jewish businesses and shoot anarchists. They urged their members to join their own paramilitary organization, the Brown Shirts, to take up arms for their cause. Hitler would, quote, fix Germany's economy through quick and violent means, confiscating wealth from one group and giving it to others, reforming a whole country around military production. Their speeches, his speeches, whipped crowds into this frenzy. He gave people energy, and eventually that energy has to go somewhere. You have an entire country, an entire people, over the course of more than a decade, being primed for something. That priming, it's not just seen in Germany in the 1930s. In America right now, one of the most visible fascist organizations is the Proud Boys, who sport the motto, "Fuck around and find out." Fascists always want to do things. They always want to do violence. There's a lot of people on this planet who want an excuse to hurt others, especially people who they think are inferior or lesser than them or have taken something away from them. And if given the opportunity, they will. Europe fucked around and eventually found out. They said, oh, surely if we give them a little bit, they'll be fine. Surely if we make a big alliance, we can scare them off. Surely there's no way they could be so bold. There's no way they could be so crazy. But the Nazis went and did it. But then they couldn't rest on their laurels. They couldn't take counsel and slow down. They could never have enough because they weren't in power to bring prosperity and progress. People liked them because they gave folks license to hurt the people they hated. They were primed with hate. They were a machine of hate, taking it in and then spewing out more. And that hate had to go somewhere. These were people who believed that they were sent by God to be the chosen people to rule the earth. Why would they stop? It would be silly to stop. And you cannot forget that when speaking of Operation Barbarossa. And it's part of what's going to make the defeats of Stalingrad so sweet to talk about tomorrow. Jay, plug us out. I can already hear the outro music building up. Let's tell the people what they need to do.
First, I'd just like to thank them for listening to this episode of No One is Competent. You can find us on Twitter at not_competent. And listen to us on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and several other services. Our email address is nooneiscompetent@gmail.com. If you have any episode idea suggestions, feel free to send them to us that way. Or you can tag us on Twitter. And our music is by Sam Bryce. This has been Jay, and of course, Azalea as well. And so, yeah, thank you for listening, and I hope you all look forward to Stalingrad.
We're gonna have so much fun. Y'all be good.